study after study has shown that education is the single most valuable thing that can happen while someone's incarcerated and the greatest predictor of success. And by success, I don't just mean that they don't go back to prison. That's one measure, but actually are able to lead fulfilling lives and contribute to society and be productive citizens. That would be my idea of success.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Lynn Novick. Lynn has been directing and producing landmark documentary films about American life and culture, history, politics, sports, art, architecture, literature, and music for more than 30 years. The 80 hours of acclaimed PBS programming she has created in collaboration with Ken Burns include the Vietnam War, baseball, jazz, Frank Lloyd Wright, the war, and Prohibition. These landmark series have garnered 19 Emmy nominations. Lynn herself has received Emmy, Peabody, and Alfred DuPont-Columbia awards. College Behind Bars, Lynn's first film as a solo director, premiered at the New York Film Festival and aired on PBS in 2019. The 4-part series immerses viewers in the inspiring and transformational journey of a small group of incarcerated men and women serving time for serious crimes as they try to earn college degrees in one of the most rigorous prison education programs in America, the Barred Prison Initiative. Lynn's latest series alongside Ken Burns, The U.S. and the Holocaust, explores the U.S. knowledge of and response to the Jewish Holocaust, the greatest humanitarian crisis of the 20th century. It's now streaming on PBS and premiering later this month in Jerusalem. We spoke at the end of August 2022, and I was excited to talk to Lynn after watching her remarkable College Behind Bars series. I watched the series after listening to an interview she did with Sam Harris on his podcast, and it really floored me. It proved so eloquently and so simply the basic truth that crime and poverty are more often than not the result of lack of opportunity, lack of access, lack of information, and lack of belonging. It shows the transformative power of education, opportunity, respect, and high expectations, even on people convicted of violent crimes. And in that way, it very subtly but powerfully condemns a system that doesn't provide such opportunities. It was wonderful to chat with Lynn, learn about her life in documentary making, and hear about her experience behind the scenes, making College Behind Bars, and her continued engagement with the students in the film long after the filming. We talked about the U.S. and the Holocaust documentary, and the anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and nativism, and the rejection of Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. We talked about how the Watergate crisis led her down the path to documentary filmmaking. The power of documentaries to change views and bring truth to life. The films she made alongside Ken Burns, covering the Vietnam War, jazz, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and many others. Then we dive into her film College Behind Bars, the process of making it, the Barred Prison Initiative and why it is so special, the history of prison and education, the power of education, history of crime and punishment in the US, and many other topics. Lynn goes deep into topic after topic in American life, and as a result, she's a broad and fascinating thinker and speaker. Beyond the incredible power of College Behind Bars, what stayed with me is the power of documentary film to start us thinking and talking about complex topics, and in some cases, like with College Behind Bars, to effect a change in policy. This conversation is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Lynn Novick. All right. I'm sitting here with Lynn Novick. Lynn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we like to connect first with the now. So my first question to you is, what is it like to be you these days? What are you doing? What are you up to?
I suppose that my life is to a large degree defined by the projects I'm working on at any given time. It absorbs a lot of my intellectual and emotional bandwidth. At the moment, Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and I have co-directed a 3-part series called The U.S. and the Holocaust, which we had been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. So we've been talking a lot about that project and its lessons for today. And while I'm doing that, I'm also hard at work on a new series that will air in about 4 years, which is about the history of crime and punishment in America. So That's mainly what's on my plate, plus a few other projects in development.
No. So I'll dive into the U.S. and the Holocaust. So tell me about, so I'm an Israeli. I grew up in, I'm an Israeli Jew. I grew up in Israel. I don't think that, will I be surprised by anything? Because we know, Israelis know, and I think Jews know that people were trying to escape from Europe and from Germany and that the doors were closed. There's not going to be a shock to me to hear that the U.S. was not letting people in, and which is one of the one of the drivers of this feeling in Israel that you can only rely on yourself and you have to have your own country because otherwise people are not going to have open doors when you need them. What do you think the audience would learn from this show?
Well, I can speak first about what I learned because I agree with you. I would imagine for many Israelis, the narrative that you just described is somewhat familiar, fairly familiar, and the very reason why Israel exists. And that history would be front and center of the national origin story. For the United States, the way we think about our own history and tell our own stories very complicated. We've never really told an honest history of ourselves to ourselves. And we're working on that. It's a work in progress. And the pendulum swings back and forth. And right now we're at this time of reckoning. We have been for a little while. And this story of how America responded to the rise of Hitler and the persecution of the Jews of Europe and the humanitarian crisis and the human catastrophe that became the Holocaust is a very challenging story for Americans to face, frankly. So maybe we'll just be catching up with what many Israelis already know. I think it probably will be surprising or interesting or at least informative for all audiences to really get a sense of the context in the United States, how our government really operated, who gets to make the policies, how things are decided. We had open doors, and my ancestors came here. 3 of my grandparents were born in the United States. 1 came here from what's now Belarusia right before the First World War. If they had tried to come later after 1924, they wouldn't have been able to get in, and I wouldn't be here today speaking to you. So something profound happened in the United States in the 1920s to shut the golden door, as it was called, in spite of the words on the Statue of Liberty, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, in spite of the fact that the United States was seen as an asylum for people fleeing persecution and seeking opportunity for hundreds of years. In the 1920s, that shifted profoundly. And that's a very dark chapter, in my opinion, of the American experience. And it has to do with kind of a extreme nativism, xenophobia, white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, and the triumphalism of the white Protestant establishment.
Yeah. It's a complex thing. Like, first of all, it feels like it's a story that's definitely not over, because with Syrian refugees, with refugees from all over the world, and what happened with refugee program under Trump. Like these things are very much alive today. And the Holocaust may be like a high watermark of cruelty and disaster in some ways, but it's not like a refugee is a refugee. A person who is running for their lives is running for their lives. The ironic thing is I'm in Israel now, and there was all this finger pointing for the world that didn't take Jews in during the Holocaust. It's a big part of the psyche, and it's a pretty right wing mindset of blaming other countries, and we have to do to ourselves. And then now with Ukraine, they did exactly the same thing. So the right wing in the Interior Department, and they didn't step up to help. I mean, there were massive amounts of refugees stuck in the airport because they didn't have a visa. Nobody was letting them in. Eventually, I guess they sort of hand waved them through. But yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the great ironies. We can all point fingers at different people or groups who were less than what we would like to think we would be. But then when faced with those challenges ourselves, how willing are we to welcome people? And with America, it's our sort of core national creed in a way. At least for hundreds of years it was. And then all of a sudden it wasn't. But we have been and continue, as you said, to disagree about who belongs here, who we should welcome, who's a worthy member of our society. And I have found it very interesting. I'm trying to understand this better than I think I did before the project, that there's just a scapegoating and kind of a, othering of people primarily by nationalist leaders or demagogues or people trying to gain power to say there's an us and there's a them. And you can slot different categories of people into either of those groups depending on what you think or people respond to. And it's not static. It evolves over time and can evolve very quickly. And so someone who might have thought they were with the us, all of a sudden you become the them,
No.
And different kinds of refugees from different places and different circumstances are welcome at some times and not welcome at other times.
It's so now it's coming out very soon. What are you hoping that it will change in people's minds, or what kind of reception are you hoping for?
We started working on this film. We started thinking about it in 2015, and we started really in production in 2018, and we finished it during the pandemic. And over the course of this time period, American society and the world has experienced the pandemic, obviously, but also this frightening resurgence of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, nativism, and just a general sort of sense that fascism is rising and that democratic institutions are weaker than I certainly thought and more at risk. And this is something that this film really shows, how quickly a democracy can become something else, and how bigotry and prejudice and hatred can be fuel on the fire for that. And seemingly decent people can do horrific things. There are horrifically evil people who also do horrific things, but we can't, I don't think, divide human nature into good and bad people and just hope that we have all the good people on our side, because it's clearly this history shows people are capable of tremendous cruelty and barbarism in some part of their life, and otherwise can be seen as, your next door neighbor.
Yeah, I lived in the States for about 10 years, and I have many American friends. And, from very early on in the Trump presidency and even in his candidacy, I said, this is a man who wants to end democracy. And I was laughed at, and I was kind of, oh, you're just being alarmist, or by my left-wing friends, by my friends who did not vote for Trump and were against Trump. When I said, no, it's very obvious. Like, you're not special. You're like every other country. There are people who don't believe in democracy and want to undermine it, and this is one of them. And listen to how he speaks. Look at how he behaves. Look at how he condones violence. This is not a man that you can safely elect to office and be 100% sure that you'll have another election. And to the last moment, some of my best, and these are smart, educated people, argued with me that it could not happen in America. And of course it could. Of course it could. And I think this is the value of what you do. It's like, I have a degree in history. You bring history to the masses in a way that they can learn from it. And
Yeah.
do you feel like this is making a difference over your kind of the span of your career? Do you feel like you've been able to make a shift in people's perspectives on some things?
I say this with hopefully a lot of humility, in that I don't personally want to take too much credit for any one thing, because what we do is very collaborative and there's a lot of people involved. And there's also the opportunity to share the work with millions of people on television and classrooms and public screenings, et cetera. We have quite a megaphone, and we use it hopefully with a lot of humility. I'd like to think that it does make a difference. I can't point to a specific case or too many cases of changing public policy, but I can point to some. I have many stories of people who've seen some of the films that I've worked on that have reached out to us, or that I've heard or written. I've seen news accounts where people really have had their minds changed about history, about policy, about any number of things. I'll give one example just to say this is, in a microcosm, what I hope happens. We did a film on the Vietnam War. So we had people who were in the United States who were in support of the war and who fought in it, and then who changed their mind over time. We had people who were never in favor of the war and served in it unwillingly. We had people who protested the war and never went. We had family members whose children or brothers were killed in the war, and over the course of that time went from supporting it to protesting. So we showed a pretty full range of American responses to this experience. And then we went to Vietnam and spoke to people who were on all sides there, and began to understand that there were just as many points of view within Vietnam as there were here, North and South, people in favor, against, who had different experiences of just the horrific nature of war itself, and questioning the causes for which so much sacrifice was being demanded that people are imposed on them. So we didn't know how the film would be received. And we heard about screenings that happened where the film, which was 10 episodes, almost 20 hours long, people came together and watched the entire film, one episode at a time, maybe once a week, in libraries and other contexts. And in one case, a group came together to watch the film. And there were people who had been in the anti-war movement, people who had served in the military during the war and been in Vietnam. And the story I read was that after the final episode, a woman who had been in the anti-war movement went up to one of the men who was a veteran, and she said, "I just want to say I'm sorry if protesting the war was hurtful to you and to other soldiers. I want to say thank you for your service and for doing what you thought was right." And the veteran said, "Thank you for saying that, but having seen this film, I realize now that the war was unwinnable, and I'm grateful to you for protesting it, because finally that helped to end the war." And she said, no, don't thank me. I just, I need to tell you, thank you for your service. And he said, no, thank you for your protest.
Wow.
And to me, that showed something profound could happen, where people are present and have an open heart anyway. Maybe that opens up your mind a little bit.
Yeah. I'd like to take us back in time, and this is a way to get to know you and your journey. What's something you've learned early in life or in childhood that still drives or guides you today?
Wow. One thing is, I grew up in New York City, and I have a sister, and we were born in the 60s. And I think in some ways had a very protected and privileged childhood, but we also grew up at a time when the nation was quite divided, and there was a lot of unrest and upheaval about civil rights, about the Vietnam War, about the integrity or the legitimacy of our government in some ways. And I can think of a lot of events that happened publicly that probably shaped my worldview. And one of them was the Watergate crisis. I was pretty young. That's the first event that I remember really paying attention to as a child, and trying to understand, how could these people who run the government be doing things that are clearly wrong? And there was a sense too, though, that there would be accountability. There were hearings, and there was daylight shown, and tapes were played that we didn't even know about before, and people went to jail, and people were punished. The president was forced to resign. And there was a sense on some level that the system worked, as flawed and problematic as it was and how close people could push to getting away with things and not respecting our society. I think in the end, I did come away from that with a sense that, there's something here that is always at risk, but ultimately will endure. And that's probably been a framing idea for me. And I'm not sure that I agree with it now, given what we were just talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So I realized that was a defining experience, and looking back, I'm really not so sure I took the right lessons from that.
There's probably many different lessons that you can take from something like this. But maybe one of them is also the truth coming to light, the public aspect of it, which is part of your work today. Do you feel like that's, that excavation of the truth was something that you took with you?
Yes. I've never really put all the pieces of this together, but one of my favorite movies of all time is All the President's Men. And I found out recently that it's taught in journalism schools because it really shows the journalistic process. And for any of your listeners who don't know what All the President's Men is, it's a movie by Alan Pakula with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman that tells the story of how the Washington Post reporters broke the Watergate story. And there's a fascinating history of that film, but it does show your point exactly, that we have faith that if we can share the truth, things will change, or people can't just continue doing the wrongs they've been doing. And that certainly has been a driving force of what I've tried to do, even though I'm not an investigative journalist, but in terms of looking at the past and re-examining familiar stories through a new light, that certainly has propelled me.
Yeah, that's great. So you started by going to medical school, is that correct?
No, I was pre-med in the US.
Pre-med,
we go to school for quite a long time, right? So I signed up to be pre-med, but I didn't last very long, even though I come from a family of doctors and scientists.
And so how did you get from there to film school? What was that search period like?
I remember my early 20s as a very difficult time, frankly, because I didn't know where I wanted to go, and I didn't know how to get there, needless to say. And after I got out of college, I was a bit lost, and I was not sure what direction to go. And I figured I'd go to grad school eventually, but I wasn't sure in what field. And so after sort of temping, working in offices, typing and filing and answering the phone, and being an intern at an environmental organization, and I just tried a bunch of different things, I ended up getting a job at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. They have a big American History Museum, and I worked there as a researcher for a while. And while I was there, I became more clear-headed that I wanted to do something in the way of public history. And I happened to see a couple of documentaries made by a filmmaker I'd never heard of, whose name was Ken Burns. And he had made a film about the Statue of Liberty, which is a beautiful film about just the idea of liberty and what the statue represents. And then he made a film about a politician from Louisiana who was assassinated in the 1930s, an incredibly popular sort of autocratic governor named Huey Long. And I saw those two films, and I remember watching them in the movie theater and thinking, oh, that's exactly what I want to do. I didn't know that was a thing that you could do. So then I went about, okay, how would I get from where I'm sitting here in the seats to being the person that does that? So I just dedicated myself to basically apprenticing myself, starting as an intern. And that's a position of privilege. Someone like me could go live with my parents, and sort of not get paid to work for, I think I gave myself 6 months to just get an internship and see if I could learn something about it. And that's what I did. So I started as an intern at the PBS station in New York. And then from there, ended up with a series of freelance jobs, working my way closer and closer toward actually working for Ken Burns, which I managed to figure out how to do after 3 years of sort of learning some skills and having something to offer. So that was my journey. And I got very lucky that Ken Burns was working on a series that came out in 1990 on the American Civil War. And I was lucky enough to be in his orbit by then. And then I basically stayed there. None of us, neither Ken, myself, nor anyone else, has a full-time permanent job. We just go from one project to another. I've moved from the Civil War to a series on baseball, to a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright, to a series on the history of jazz, to a series on the American experience of the Second World War. And I could list all my credits. But anyway, each of these projects is 3 or 4 years long. Sometimes they overlap. And each one stretches us in different ways. Very diverse, eclectic, seemingly random collection of topics.
Yeah, but they all sort of, or at least most of them, tell the story of America and some key aspect of the American experience. And I loved looking at a little bit of the Frank Lloyd Wright movie. Tell me about that, because I'm a huge fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. One of my favorite trips was like in Oak Park in Chicago to see all of these different houses and his development. So yeah, tell me about that.
That was really, truly one of my favorite projects that I've had the opportunity to work on as well, because Frank Lloyd Wright led an incredibly interesting life, and he had a huge impact on the way we live and how we think about architecture and what a building should be or could be. And he's a very interesting personality with a very eventful life. And the best thing about that project was getting to meet and interview some amazing, brilliant thinkers and architects and scholars of his work. But really the best part was getting to visit and film so many of his masterpieces. And pictures just can't do justice to what these spaces are. They're profound experiences to be inside a Frank Lloyd Wright building. The outside, sometimes, interesting how it fits into the landscape or doesn't, but it's the inside to me that really makes you feel something. And we tried very hard to, working with our cinematographer, Betty Squires, to come up with ways to convey on screen by moving through the spaces with the camera, some approximation of what it feels like to be there.
I was thinking for camera, but like next step is VR and like actually capturing the three-dimensionality of these spaces and letting you actually be inside of them. That would be an incredible project.
I agree, because we couldn't really do it. Even we tried our best, but not the same.
I'll never forget, one of the houses on the tour had an open house for buyers. So we were able to get inside and say, we're considering buying. And we looked around. It's gorgeous. And you're right. The inside is so much more meaningful, I think, because I think he designed it for the experience of being inside and not for how it looks from the outside.
Exactly. Yeah. And, he's not a terribly likable person in many ways. And I think we're willing to and want to explore creativity, ego, self-promotion, narcissism. We didn't use that word then for him, but for someone to create on that scale and to get clients to give you free reign to build a house for them, and at no matter what cost, he had many of the talents, gifts, and skills to make that happen. And, I met his son, his last surviving child, and you could really tell that it wasn't easy being a child of Frank Lloyd Wright. His buildings were the children that he cared about, and he was pretty open about that.
So you've covered the Civil War, baseball, jazz, the Vietnam War, Frank Lloyd Wright, all of these topics of American life. And we'll get to College Behind Bars in a second. I think it's phenomenal. But where do you stand? How does this complicate, enrich, problematize your view of America? What's your conclusion from all of this?
Well, I think in the films I've made in collaboration with Ken Burns and Jeff Ward and Sarah Botstein and other collaborators, we all have slightly different perspectives about that very question, which is at the core of why we want to tell these stories. And I put myself probably in the camp of being more pessimistic and critical. And some of my colleagues are perhaps a bit more optimistic and see a brighter future and even a brighter past. I really am grateful to have been the beneficiary of so much American life and privilege that I've had. On the other hand, the gap between the values that our society claims to have and the rights and promises that we make, the gap between that and what we actually do is so vast. And our attempts, or the times in which we have worked towards making it better, have come only after tremendous pressure from the people who heard those words, all men are created equal. We promise due process and equality and justice, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all these things, but we don't deliver. The jury is very much still out on what kind of country we
Yeah.
really are.
America is so hard to encapsulate because it's almost like these opposites are always, you can often find in every topic, the very best examples in the world and the very worst are often in the same country. To me, it's like America is this really great battlefield of ideas and approaches. And because individuals, it's such an individual place, you see really the best of and the worst of, and you see the battle and like the evolution over time. And it's much less cohesive than many other smaller countries. And
I agree. I also wonder sometimes, especially lately, whether we really are one nation. Sometimes it feels that we're just a collection of states or localities. It's a huge country geographically, but also what goes on in Mississippi and what goes on in Illinois are pretty different. And so the fact that we have had, and I'm just beginning to really understand this, but what are the things that make us a nation as opposed to a collection of states? That was a question from the founding of this country. How much were we going to be leaving everything to the local authorities to decide what they want to do? Or are we going to have some kind of cohesive national identity, which is reflected in the way we organize ourselves and who has rights and what life is like? We've had moments when that's been more the case. Right now, I think we're in a place where perhaps less so. And then we also have overlaid on it the fact that the way our government is structured in the Constitution and subsequently is that it's profoundly undemocratic and that the Senate weights power way too much to smaller minorities. And then, it gets exacerbated with the Supreme Court. So we have certain kind of institutional problems, systemic problems. There's been a lot of talk about reforming the Electoral College and the Supreme Court. I would have said, oh, that's way too radical a few years ago. But I've come around to thinking that America's not really fully a democracy right now, the way I think that a democracy could be, which is people participate and they have to compromise and make decisions. But the way our Senate works right now, a small percentage of the people are deciding what happens.
Yeah, there's a pattern that I've seen living in America, which is so funny because it happens across the board, is America is usually the first in some technology, and then it gets stuck with old infrastructure. So if you go around the rest of the world, they have faster internet, better roads, better infrastructure, better cell phone networks. And it happened in America first, but then just because of the history of implementation, you're stuck with the old way. Whereas in other countries, they're like, okay, what's the latest? Okay, we'll just implement that. And they have better infrastructure. So internet in many other places is like faster, more reliable, fiber, whatever. And in America, they're still catching up because it's and some places are still in dial-up. Nobody's using dial-up in Israel. That's not a thing. But in America, if you go to some rural places, that's the only thing they have. And I feel it's probably the same with democracy. It's the first really democratic country, and you get stuck with these institutions, which are, it's really hard to reform, and they're not necessarily the latest and greatest. It's not like this is like version 1.0, but there's probably like now we're probably at 2.0.
I agree. That's so brilliant. I think I never thought about it that way, but yeah, they were trying something. It was quite an experiment to have people make their own rules and have a real democracy. And the founders were worried about certain aspects of what could go wrong there. And they also had to protect the institution of slavery and build in some protections, critical protections for how that would go, which set up some profoundly undemocratic aspects of our society that have never been undone. So if we could get a do-over, that would be great.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. I want to ask about College Behind Bars. What made you choose this project? What was the spark?
Like a lot of projects I've worked on, it's somewhat serendipitous. In this case, I have a friend who was teaching in a program inside a prison, a college program. And he asked, would I come and talk about a film that we had made about Prohibition, he was teaching a course on social movements in American history, and he wanted to have a class based on our film. And so my colleague, Sarah Botstein, and I agreed to go. And I'd never been inside a prison before. I'd never certainly been in a college class inside a prison, goes without saying. And that was in 2012, 10 years ago. And I will confess to being a little apprehensive and not quite sure. On the way to the class, I asked the professor, what are the students like or something? I tried to ask something kind of neutral, but, carrying a lot of baggage, I'm sure, about people who are incarcerated and how they would react to this class, whatever. And he said, these students are really impressive. And I'm teaching a class at NYU in the Graduate School of Public Policy right now. And the students that are incarcerated are much better. And I remember thinking, really? I'm ashamed to admit that. At least I had the presence of mind to say, what do you mean? And he said, well, they take the class more seriously. They're much better writers and thinkers. And so I went into the classroom with that question in my head. And within 10 minutes of being there, I could see what he meant. The students were extraordinarily focused, rigorous thinkers. It was the most sophisticated conversation I've had about any film, pretty much anywhere. So I walked out of the classroom, and Sarah, my colleague, and I turned to each other and said, oh my God, that was incredible. We had no idea that this kind of discourse was happening inside a prison, that this would be an amazing film. But we weren't thinking we would do it. It just was an idea. You see something amazing and you think, if you're a filmmaker, that would be a great film. I actually got in touch with the people who run the program, which is part of a small college in upstate New York called Bard College. And I said, we just had an amazing experience in this classroom and I'd love to get involved. What could I do? And they asked me if I would teach a course on documentary or teach a film class in the program. And I said yes, but with a great amount of trepidation because I've never taught at the university level. So I was quite intimidated by the idea that I would have to stand up in front of students as smart as these students were and pretend to be a professor, which I am definitely not. But I partnered with a friend who has a PhD and teaches media studies at Columbia, and she and I taught the course together. And it was amazing. I learned so much about teaching. I learned a lot about our practice of documentary because that's what we were teaching. So it was a great class. And when we finished the class, I was really convinced that we should do a film somehow. And that took several years to get permission from the Department of Corrections of the state of New York, from the students in the program, from the program itself, and to put together a small budget to start filming. And as soon as we started filming, which was in 2014, it became pretty clear to us that this was a very powerful story that would need to be filmed over time, because we were interested in showing not just that this is happening, but what does it mean? And to do that, we wanted to see how people experiencing education at this level would be transformed over time. So we filmed for 4 years. And over that time, you really meet people and you see how their way of speaking changes, the way of thinking changes, the way of understanding themselves in the world and relating. They speak about all this, just their appreciation for their situation and the social conditions around them. And, they're studying the Greeks, they're studying advanced math, they're studying advanced biology, learning Chinese, all these different things, and how that opens up their mind to the possibilities of what life can be. This extremely profound experience for us to be present as we just could collect all this material over time. And then to take 400 hours and boil it down to a 4-hour series.
You did a remarkable job. So I listened to your interview with Sam Harris, and
okay, great.
He was floored, and then I had to watch the series, and I was completely floored. And so I want to dive deeper because there's something unbelievably powerful about seeing this transformation. And I have to say, it's not just the 4 years; it's also the very fact of the program and how it treats the students from the very start. I think
Yep.
there's light in their eyes when they understand that they're students now, right? And so I'd love for you to explain maybe what is this Bard Prison Initiative? What is it about?
Sure. Yeah. So I have to go back a little bit to give a little bit of context because to help understand why what they do was so unusual, which was that in 1994, the United States passed very draconian criminal justice policies. And part of that was to remove Pell Grants, which was federal funding for low-income students to go to college. And that was available to people who were in prison. They're clearly, most of them are low income. And it was just removed. And overnight, basically, college programming in prisons was removed. States also doubled down on that. So New York State had a program that also provided tuition assistance, and they canceled it. And so you went from a situation where there was college of some sort or higher education available in prisons to there wasn't. That was 1994. In 2001, 2002, Bard College, through the efforts of actually a young man who was still in college at the time, he got interested in this issue and convinced the college to basically support the idea of having a class, getting a professor to come in and teach a class in a prison. And that evolved into a fully accredited program, first with an associate's degree and then with a bachelor's degree. And it was very unusual when they started and remains somewhat unusual to this day. There's something like 2 million people incarcerated in the United States, and a tiny fraction have access to college right now. And they philosophically, from the beginning, understood and lived up to the idea that inside that classroom, the people who are enrolled in their program are students first. And they are treated as other students on their main campus outside of prison. And as a professor in the program, or if you're a faculty, you go through a little bit of training, not much. And the main thing they tell you is we strongly discourage you or / forbid you to look up your students' criminal records. It's not relevant to the class. It's not relevant to your relationship with them as a teacher. And frankly, none of your business. They don't say it like that. But essentially, how is that relevant to what you're doing? And so when we went to make the film, we follow that same idea, essentially. For the viewer, you meet students and you see how the orientation, basically, they're brought into the program and told, you are students now. When you walk in this door and that door closes behind you, you're a part of Bard College. This is our campus. We have certain codes of behavior and how we treat each other, and just like any other orientation on any other college campus. And, that's a fine line for the people, the students enrolled, to walk sometimes, because when they walk out the door, they have to go back to being incarcerated. And that can be extremely challenging in ways that the film shows. But it is a very liberating experience for them to be in those classrooms. And not just in the classroom, but even after school, outside of the classroom. It transforms the experience of incarceration when you're in the yard, when you're in your cell, when you're having a meal, you're talking to your cohort, fellow classmates about whatever you're reading or whatever homework assignment. And so it kind of transforms their day-to-day experiences be way beyond the time they spend in the classroom.
One of the main things that I found moving, and I think that maybe the students also found moving, is basically the message: you're just like any other student. This is not simplified, or we're not lowering our standards. In fact, this is very high standard program. You have to work really hard, but when you get the degree, it will be the exact same degree that someone from the outside would get. You can see in the movie the light in there, kind of, oh wow, and I have to take this seriously, but oh wow, this is like someone is treating me like like an actual student.
Absolutely. And if any of the students that I've gotten to know were here, they would say that they had rarely been treated that way in their prior to incarceration academic experiences in low-income neighborhoods and under-resourced schools. They were often basically given the opposite message, that you're not smart, you won't amount to anything. One of my favorite lines in the film, Daiwan, who's one of the wonderful people that we got to know, he talks about how coming into the program, and what really struck him was that you have these amazing professors and they start teaching you how smart you are. They don't make you smart. They're just showing you that you have potential and you can realize it. And that's a profound experience that many of these students had never had. And that just speaks to the way that our society is organized and the extraordinary talent pool that is sidelined, marginalized, and wasted. And I will say this, the faculty that I've talked to, and I've talked to many faculty who've taught in this program, say that it's not that they teach it at the same level they teach on the outside. They actually have to make it harder because the students, the incarcerated students, do all the homework. They do all the reading. They read the footnotes. They come to class with very complex questions to ask. One of the professors, Craig Wilder, was saying to me on his first day teaching in the program, and he's a professor at MIT. He's taught at Columbia and Dartmouth and Williams and many other places. He went into class and a student raised their hand and said, Professor Wilder, in the reading, I saw that the footnote on page 62 conflicts with the footnote on page 79. And they're using different sources. And could you please comment on which of these two footnotes you think, And he said, in all his years of teaching, he has never had a student ever ask anything about a footnote. And that just speaks to the hunger for knowledge, the seriousness of purpose, and the dedication of these students.
It feels so impactful simply because it's just never happened to these people before. It's the first time that they have this opportunity, and bam, they take advantage of it, and they're in a completely different place at the end. In your mind, what does it say about the system that this is so rare?
That's the key question, really. There's a lot to say about that, and the system, our education system to begin with. So many of the people in our society who have enormous potential are just treated as if they have none, and underestimated and over-policed and just taken off the track, pushed off the track of what can happen when you have education. And then after a series of decisions and policies and resources applied or misapplied in different ways, a lot of people end up incarcerated, having been failed by our education system. And then once you're incarcerated, okay, so let's assume for the sake of argument that they have actually committed harm of some sort, broken a law, and we as a society have decided that we should either punish or help them to do better next time, whatever reason we think we're doing this. Okay, but let's just say we're doing it, and that's another whole conversation. What's going to happen while you're inside these spaces? You're just going to be dehumanized and put in a cage and bored out of your mind and left to watch TV and mop the floor while you're spending 10 years at the taxpayer's expense, enormous expense? Or don't we have some kind of responsibility to them and to ourselves to give them the opportunity that they didn't have before to have this transformation happen and to emerge from that experience able to participate in society and be citizens and realize their potential, all those things. And, the thing is, study after study has shown that education is the single most valuable thing that can happen while someone's incarcerated and the greatest predictor of success. And by success, I don't just mean that they don't go back to prison. That's one measure, but actually are able to lead fulfilling lives and contribute to society and be productive citizens. That would be my idea of success. And education is enormously effective and not very expensive. I will say that while we were working on the film, there was quite a shift in the national conversation about criminal justice and incarceration. When we started working on the film, the general kind of public consensus was, well, people in prison are there for a reason, and we don't want them to have any benefits, and they should be made to just basically stay there, and we don't want to spend money on them, period. And certainly not education. It's not fair. You heard that a lot. It's not fair for someone who's done something wrong to be getting access to quote unquote free education when I have to pay to send my kids to college. And I mean, I'll be the first to say college is way too expensive in the United States, and that's a huge problem. Sure. But that's a different problem than the one I'm talking about, right? But over the course of the time that our film, we were working on it, and then when it came out, it really had begun to shift. And one of the reasons why I think one of the things that helped it shift was that the Barred Prison Initiative students have a debate team. And while we were working on the film, they had different colleges came in to compete with them. And one of them was Harvard. And they beat Harvard. And it was a huge international media sensation. It was really incredible. It went around the world. And the coverage generally was quite positive. Look at what these guys could do when given a chance. That was the general message. And that suggested to us, among other things, that things were shifting. In the end of 2020, as part of a big end-of-year spending bill, Congress voted and President Trump signed a restoration of Pell Grants for people in prison. Wow. So that 1994 policy is now reversed. And so millions of dollars will begin flowing to people in prison to get access to higher education. So that's going into effect next year.
Yeah, and it's incredible. And then you look at the numbers. You actually put numbers in the movie about 51,000 men and 2,400 women are incarcerated in New York City. Only 950 have access to higher education, and I think a significant percentage was from this one program. So, would you say making this movie changed you? And if so, and what was that like?
Being involved in this project definitely changed me in so many ways. It's hard to really wind back to where I was at when we started and how I think about the world now. Spending a lot of time inside prison had an effect on me. I can't exactly put words around precisely how, but it's a physical experience, emotional experience of just being in this incredibly oppressive space, even though the classrooms we were in were not oppressive, but just getting there, meeting with people inside their cells, seeing how the guards interact with the people who are incarcerated. And so I think gave me an appreciation for how important it is for anyone and everyone who's a citizen of our society to try to understand what's going on. This is very important institutions that we have no idea what goes on in there. So that's one lifelong change. Seeing the transformative power of education acting in real time also gave me such a deep gratitude for the education I've had and the opportunities I've had, because I think I took them for granted, frankly. So it just gave me a little bit of regret, but also understanding how lucky I am and how fortunate I was that I had access to the education when I did, due in large part nothing to do with me, but just the circumstances of my life. Because I think Americans are very much taught, as you were saying before, this individualistic society suggests that if you've accomplished anything, it's because you're very special.
Right.
You worked hard and you deserve everything. I don't hold on to that at all at this point. I think, yes, I work hard, and people who have accomplished a lot generally probably work hard, although not always. But the forces that organize our society have a lot to do with who has access to various kinds of resources and who doesn't. Yeah.
And just having someone to believe in you and put standards in front of you and place knowledge in your hands and give you the time and space to be able to absorb them and all of these things, it's so easy to take for granted. And so, how engaged are you with these topics, these people that are in the movie after the production is done? Are you still, because one of the open questions that the movie kind of leaves open is like, how are now they're going to do now that they're out of prison?
Yeah.
With the stigma, and so, what can you tell me about that?
Yes, we've all remained in very close contact. COVID has made that very challenging, unfortunately. And so we haven't gotten together in person as much as we would have liked, but I'm in contact with pretty much everybody that you see in the film, and I know what everybody's up to. And everybody that you see on camera in the film is now no longer incarcerated. So that was important to recognize that over time, because I think Americans don't really quite realize this, 95% of people who are in prison will be coming home. We have very long sentences, horribly long sentences, and that is slowly being adjusted. But even so, everybody comes home. So the question of how you want people to come home is a real one. Some are doing public policy, some are working in the private sector, some are in grad school or finishing their undergrad if they didn't finish it before they got released. Sebastian Yoon, who's a Korean-American young man, he is working at the Open Society Foundation, overseeing a huge pool of money that's to do with enhancing democracy in the United States and access to the vote. Rodney Spivey, who was the last of the students in the film to come home, is applying to law school. Taiwan is working at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So people are doing amazing things.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about the history of crime and punishment in America and what you've learned so far. What captured your storytelling, filmmaking kind of instinct?
The idea of this new project is to do a deep dive into the story of America through the prism of crime and punishment. So it's kind of a reframing of American history with this as the central organizing principle. And starting before the United States was a country, the colonial period. What was our system of crime and punishment, both for people who were enslaved and for people who were not? So indentured servants, colonists, settlers, native peoples, etc., and bring that all the way up to the present. Well, we've learned a lot so far. I'm still learning every day, but a lot of the projects I work on, I don't know that much about before I start. So that's the same here. I did not know, and I suspect that many of your listeners will not know, that before the early 19th century, there weren't really prisons as we think of them today in the United States. There were jails, and jails were places where if you were arrested, you might be held there until your trial. Or if you were tried and then your punishment was going to be corporal punishment, usually, or you were going to be executed, which was often a very common punishment, you'd be held there until that happened. Or if you were a runaway slave, you might be held there until someone came to get you. But being put in jail was not considered the punishment. And we built prisons and penitentiaries partly because this new nation, this new democracy, with these ideals of liberty and equality and justice for all, felt that the way crime was dealt with before was too barbaric and brutal.
Like
people would be
cruel
whipped in
and
the public
unusual.
square. They would have their ear cut off. Yes,
Yeah.
cruel and unusual punishment. So the idea was, let's not do that anymore. That's not worthy of a democracy. We should be treating people better with more humanity. So that was the idea behind prisons. And when we built these prisons, they were monuments to the modern age of the early 19th century, and they became tourist attractions. And people came from all around the world to see this American experiment in democracy, and the prisons were a manifestation of that. So just unpacking how we got here, we have to start with some basic questions. What is prison for? Why do we have them? What do we think is happening there? Who's locked up in them? And that's been very interesting just to explore that. And then another big thread is policing. Why do we have police? These are questions that seem to have simple answers, but they're really not so simple. Who do the police work for, and do they prevent crime? Do they solve crime? Do they protect property? And that also goes into some deep questions about what is a crime. So right now we're arguing about whether abortion should be a crime. Prostitution, gambling, alcohol was a crime for a while in the United States. Interracial relationships were a crime. Teaching a Black person to read was a crime. These just questions of what we make a crime reflect our values for good and bad. So that's sort of a thread that we're pulling through. We're going to hopefully provoke a conversation that's beyond mass incarceration to a deeper question of, when I said, what is a crime? It's also, why do people do things? Why do people not obey the rules, shall we say? Or, who doesn't and for what reasons? And I've been finding it really fascinating. There's an evolving body of scientific exploration of that very question. So you have experts in different time periods saying immigrants are bad. So the reason why we have crime is because we have so many immigrants. Or Black people are dangerous and they're inherently criminal, and that's why we have so much crime. Or poor people are lazy and that's why they're poor. I'm using words that were used at the time, and there's sort of underlying ideas about who's a good person, who's a bad person, why we need to have the systems that we have to protect people from the other people. There's a lot of kind of philosophical underpinnings of sort of going beyond the policy questions to sort of understanding of human nature and also our collective responsibility. So
yeah, there
we'll
seems
see.
to be like a strong connection between a belief in free will that has its origin in a very religious worldview. And then if you have free will,
Exactly.
God gave you free will, and then you make bad choices, then it's all up to you. It's all on you. Your soul is not good or whatever. Whereas coming at it from a more scientific worldview, there could be any number of factors contributing to your evolution. And can we even hold someone responsible for making a choice if they don't know that there is an alternative? If we never showed them that there's another way to act. And I personally believe that we can't make choices that we don't know exist. That's the bare minimum we have to teach people about different ways of being.
That's so well said, and that's foundational. I remember one of the students in College Behind Bars, Giovanni, was talking about when he grew up, all he knew was his block in the South Bronx. He just didn't even know there was a world outside of that. So to see possibilities of other ways of living than the way he saw the people around him living, it wasn't there until they got incarcerated and went to college and understood a bigger picture of the world. You can only see what's around you. It's really true.
Yep.
So, yeah.
When I moved to New York, my first 2 years, I lived in the Bronx, and my roommate was an English teacher. And he said, most of my kids that I teach have never been to Manhattan. And to me, that was, I came all the way from Israel to live in New York. Of course, Manhattan is just like a couple of stops on the subway.
Yes, exactly. It's surprising how narrow people's worlds can be and how that shapes how they think about what their options are. I think poverty is inherently also like walls around you, actually. It's not a physical constraint in that sense that you could always go to Manhattan or whatever, but your perspective and your sense of what's possible is inherently going to be very constrained just by kind of poverty that we have in our society.
Yeah. So I have one final question for you. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being kind of a modern day, dry, factual way of delivering information. And a sermon is a way to really grab people by the collar and give them something that could change their life, that you really believe urgently believe can change their life. And so my question to you is, if you had an opportunity to give a short sermon, what would it be about?
I think if I were to try to impart something that's core to what I try to live my life and do the work I do, it would be to help to try to explain and maybe give some examples of how being fully present with other people is one of the most important things you can do, and to treat people with respect and listen to them without judgment and just let them be who they are and hear what they have to say and don't interrupt and just try to understand who at one level you get a deep understanding of the human condition and yourself and the world over time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Lynn, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was super wonderful to hear from you, and I think a great conversation for our listeners.
Thank you for having me. It was such a great conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about so many different things.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.